Margie here. Oftentimes, we get so busy with our lives that we forget to tune into our bodies and our mind. And unfortunately, this has negative health effects on both our bones and overall health. And today, we're going to focus on self-awareness and how powerful this can be and how we can all incorporate that into our lives. And our special guest is Dr. Rishma Walji. And Rishma is a naturopathic doctor, an acupuncturist, and she's also a life strategist, emotion hacker, and joy seeker. And she had a thriving clinical practice for over 20 years, focusing on hormone health and fertility. She also has a PhD, and she's been working and teaching in academia. But now she uses her tools and all her experience by creating a cultivating and supportive community of growth-minded women who inspire each other as to improve their health and make meaningful relationships. And today we're talking about self-awareness, and she's going to really show us how listening to your body and your needs can really lead to a healthier, happier, and fulfilling life. So stay tuned. Welcome, Rishma. I'm really thrilled to have you here on the podcast. And I think what we're talking about today is something that affects everybody and not something that we typically talk about. So I'm really excited to bring this piece into awareness, actually. So welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
So you have such an incredible background, working in fertility, working with women for 20 years with hormones. But you've seen that there's more to it, and that so often this lack of awareness of ourselves is something that can majorly affect people's health in so many ways. So could you just sort of explain how you got to that? Like how you came from just maybe a little bit about your background too, how you changed from what you were doing or saw that this piece was something that needed to be addressed?
Yeah, for sure. I think I actually am a very analytical person because I'm always thinking about what things mean and why it means a certain thing and how we can make things better. And so I always notice, even in my own life, like, how can I make this better? What am I needing in life? And I've noticed this in my patients too. So when I was working in clinical practice, I noticed that people would come in and they would ask all these questions and they wouldn't be able to, I guess, connect the dots between what their body was saying and what they were feeling and what they were thinking. And it makes sense. They don't have the health training or the background. But what was really sad to me was a lot of people would come in their 40s and say, like, I've had hormones for my whole life and I've had these hormonal cycles since I was a teenager. Like, why did I not know this until now when I'm in my 40s? And so that was the piece that was really, I think, hard for me to think, like, I don't know why you didn't know this. Why did no one ever teach you how to connect the dots? And so this is where I feel like it's important to know yourself. And then it's also important to ask the right questions to the right people to be able to fill in those blanks.
And why do you think what was missing? Like, why do you think people don't know themselves? They just go through life and, it would seem sort of, how could they not know? What do you think causes this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we think that life has to be a certain way, or, if we have pain, we try a few things and we try to get rid of it and it doesn't work, or we try a few methods and somehow we still have pain and we think, okay, well, this is just my lot in life. Maybe it's that internal dialogue. Maybe it's that we don't have the resources to know that there's other options. There are other things out there that could help us. So I think there's a lot of issues with not being able to know the answer, not being able to ask the questions to people who might have the answer, especially before the internet. Like now we actually have more resources, but a lot of times it's also that we get caught up in life. And I think this is the case with so many things. It could be with mood, it could be with health, it could be with hormones, pain. We just get caught up in life. This will go away. I've had this for a while. Oh, I've just always had it. I'm just going to forget about it. And we just get caught up in things rather than trying to figure out how we can make it better. And I think we need to have that hope and that idea that it can get better if we can just find the right tools to deal with it.
So where do people start? Where do you start with the people you work with?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think the first thing is we need to look for patterns. So pattern recognition is really important. I think in self-awareness, we try to notice acute things. Like most people will notice I have a headache, or, I'm in pain, or my back hurts, that kind of thing. Or every time I get my period, I get grumpy, like we notice these things one off. And then what we need to do is realize that there are patterns. So as you notice patterns of recognition, that every time I get my period, I'm grumpy, or every time I don't sleep well, I get a headache. As you find these patterns, even if it's emotional, right? Every time, my husband and I have a conversation, I get upset about something. If there's some sort of pattern that you're noticing, then that's the first step to realize that there might be some kind of, whether it be an imbalance, whether it be a desire that you haven't fulfilled in life, whether it be, something in your hormones or in your body chemistry. So as soon as you recognize patterns, that's the first clue that your body's trying to tell you something. I used to tell this to my patients. Our body has a language, our body, our mind, our body's trying to talk to us. We have pain, we have cramps, we have headaches, whatever it is. It's trying to say like, hey, I'm dehydrated, or my hormones are off. We just don't speak the same language. So we don't always understand what our bodies are trying to tell us. So recognizing patterns is sort of that first step in really understanding what our bodies are trying to say. And then of course we need to be able to ask questions and say like, this is a pattern, it's happening over and over, what can I do about it? And I think having those options with various types of health providers, or even just having a community of people to talk to who might be like, oh, I have that problem too. A lot of times we don't talk about stuff. We feel shy, or we feel embarrassed, or we feel like something's wrong with us. And so we don't connect with other people. And I think that's the power of having people in your life where you feel like you can trust them and talk to them.
Wow, you hit on so many topics here. But first of all, are there any tools like journaling? Is there any tools that you suggest? Because a lot of times, as you said so nicely, it's true, we're so busy, we don't even tune in to ourselves at all. And that's a real problem. But are there any things that you recommend people do? I know oftentimes with food, people keep a food diary, and so they see what food affects them. But is there something else that you might suggest that people who really aren't tuned in and they don't even know, it's hard for them to even think of what patterns they might have, or somewhere where there's questions, or is there anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of different tools out there. And I think some of it is just forming that habit of always questioning. But if it's hormones, for example, there's a lot of apps that are out there. And I always used to tell my patients where if you're paying attention to your hormones, just writing down when you get your period is not enough, right? You need to know how you feel. How was the period? What happened around that time? What was going on? So really having a lot of detail. It's the same with food diaries. When you keep track of your food that you're eating, you also have to keep track of your bowel movements and your gas and your bloating and your energy, because otherwise the food itself is not enough to really give you that information. And so it's the same with our emotions, right? When we're journaling, I'm a big fan of journaling. I know you are too. I think journaling is great, and also really understanding like the context of that emotion. The other thing that I find really useful, and I think you do this as well, is having group conversations, whether it's workshops. Like I know in our community, we do workshops where we talk about things, because sometimes you need an outside perspective. You need like an observer, right? That someone's like, oh, you had this and you said this again last time and you said this again this time. It's sort of a way, as long as it's a non-judgmental, sort of supportive person that's in your life that can kind of help you to identify patterns. That's another really good way, because sometimes we get caught up in our own bodies and we don't even realize. That's happened to me before too, where I don't realize what's happening to me until I sort of take a step back and look at myself from the outside. So journaling is really good. Apps can be really helpful, as long as you're adding a lot more information than just what happened, what time was it, like what is the context of what's happening. And that I think is the key to finding those patterns.
I think that's great. So whatever people are dealing with in terms of emotions, in terms of what their issue is, I think that's really very helpful, that you can just sort of focus on that. Well, when is that happening? And start tuning into all those details. That's really great. And what about, you talked about your period, but what about people postmenopausal? Are there certain things that they should be tuning into?
For sure. Yeah. Emotions are really important. Your body, your health. I think at this point, after you are postmenopausal, your body goes through a lot of changes during that transition. And so if there was anything that you noticed even during that transition, it's important. But afterwards, everything sort of shifts. Your body is in a different state. And so paying attention to that is really important. I know for me, going through, this transition in my career and transition in my life, I feel like I'm going through a bit of let's call it a renaissance, because that's like the most empowering word that I can find, where I feel like I am I'm in this place where I can pay attention to myself in a way that I never could before. And I think this is what happens when women go through this transition, even with their hormones, because things in life have changed. The kids are maybe older, they don't need as much attention. Your career is maybe in a different place, your relationship is in a different place, and your body is in a different place. And so we can really use that extra energy, that extra time, that extra emotional freedom, let's say, where you're not always having to make sure your kids are staying alive and, all of those things. You can kind of redirect it to yourself. And so it allows us to have that more opportunity to pay attention to our bodies and our body's needs. So I have women who have said, I've been in pain since my kids were born, and I just never dealt with it because my kids were toddlers and I was lifting them. But now that they're grown and they've left the house and I have, more time, I'm realizing that this back pain is really limiting me. And now they're taking that time to address it. So I think part of it is noticing the changes in your body, in your emotion, and in your needs, because our needs also change as we move through life, but also really taking that time and giving ourselves permission to focus on those things.
Okay. That's such a good point that you brought out, because it's never too late for anything. And, don't people shouldn't settle at any point in their life. They can make changes that are so empowering and impact the entire rest of their life. So I love that. You also brought up something so key, and that is community. And there's been so much research. There was this major study out of Harvard where they looked at people's happiness over 80 years. And they found that what was the absolutely key ingredient? The people that you surround yourself with. And I think we can minimize that. We don't realize how important community is. And especially so many of us have been really in a lot more isolation this year and this past year with COVID and everything going on, and that this community is just so essential. And I know that's so important in the work you do. So why don't you share some of the examples or how it's helped people? I know you've shared a few things, but if you could elaborate on that, because
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'll share a personal story first before we get into it, because I think this will kind of give an idea. A lot of people ask me, like, you had this career and you were, in clinical practice, and then you left. And there was something that happened that relates to self-awareness. I was going for a walk. This was like shortly after the pandemic. I was in stress. Like, of course, there was all these things happening. And we were going for a walk, and I realized, like, I had all these patients who needed me. My kids were home. My parents, our families were, we had some health issues in our families that we were taking care of. And we were on this walk. I was on this walk with my husband. And he was like, for 20 years, you've been talking to me about how when people are in stress mode and then they don't get out of it, they don't stop, they don't take time for themselves, they don't like reevaluate their needs, they just do what needs to be done, because of course you prioritize your kids before yourself. Of course you prioritize, all the things you need to do before yourself. And he said, you always tell me that if you could just catch people before they got into this really intense stress, that you could prevent a bunch of diagnoses. And it's true. I used to always say, like, anytime someone's in a long period of stress and then they have another acute stress, they come back with some major diagnosis. And it's sort of a pattern that I've noticed in practice. And it was good that he's been listening to me all those years, because he then pointed it out to me that I was like, right, I'm in this place right now where I need to listen to my own needs rather than prioritizing all these other things that I think are important. And so I actually ended up taking some time off, journaling, doing all of these, health and wellness things that I knew how to do and that I was doing a little bit, but not enough, because I needed them in those moments. And one of the things that came out of that was just realizing that in my own life, as much as I loved my job, I have a wonderful family, I love all of it, I needed some time to myself. I needed some time to remember who I was and remember what my hobbies were and remember, what I needed for growth, because I had been caught up in life and I had a great life. Don't get me wrong. I'm really thankful and blessed and all of that. But I needed something that could just reignite the spark in me. Like, who was I outside of all of those other responsibilities? And so that's what sort of sparked this community where I'm sort of building this new thing that I'm really enjoying. And it started as a passion project, but now I'm really leaning into it because I just needed to be around other people who felt the same way, who had similar interests, who were like-minded. And it's become this thing that fills my cup as much as hopefully I'm filling other people's cups. And so we have workshops. Some of them are very social. We just, I was like, I want to try painting. Does anyone want to do a paint night? And we do, this social experiment where we just like paint, and we do book clubs and things like that, because it's bringing me joy and it's bringing them joy. And it's just nice to be around other people who feel that way. But one of the examples of this, what you were talking about, is being around other people, is we do workshops now because people say, how you're journaling, like, how do you journal? What does that mean? And so I'm like, oh, let's share. Let's talk about how I do goal setting, how I do, and in one of our workshops where we're talking about self-care, I said, I needed to evaluate my values. And we all have different values, right? Like, of course, I value my kids. Of course, I value my family, like all of these things where we should value these things. And what I realized was I value growth. And that was something that I prioritize over so many things, subconsciously, not realizing it. And when we went through this workshop, it was something that I realized about myself, because sometimes, as much as I love my family, I feel like, I don't want to use the word resentful, but sometimes I feel resentful because I'm like, oh, I need to spend all this time doing things for other people. And as much as I value all of that, I realized, oh, I value personal growth. And this is why I feel this emotion that comes up that I shove away, that I'm like, I shouldn't be feeling this. And I should just, be a good mom and a good wife and a good whatever. And so as soon as I realized that this was an important value for me, I figured out in this community a way to bring personal growth to myself so that I could also enjoy those other roles in life. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. And the other thing that I think is something that's very important is that a lot of times we don't catch it in ourselves, but we hear someone else saying it, we're like, oh, yes, that's me. That's an issue that I'm dealing with that I didn't realize. So I think the group is so powerful. And I felt the same way. I have a happiness program and a community, and that kept me going. It was in a way selfish. It was, it was just a win-win for everybody. Well, tell us a little more about what your current group is. Is that something available to everybody?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for pointing that out, because I got off track telling a personal example, but it is true. Like, being in this group, you end up hearing what other people say. And that is the power of being in that group, where they can say something and you realize it about yourself, so you can separate. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, right now it's very high touch. So it's very personal. I'm not posting it on social media or anything like that. But people can definitely reach out through the website if they're interested, and I can have a chat with them and kind of let them know. I'm really trying to keep the vibe very supportive, very encouraging, very growth minded. And so I'm really in touch with every single community member. I talk to them, we have a conversation, we make sure it's a good fit for both ends. I kind of give them a sense of what it is. And it's a really iterative process. I'm just trying to create it in a way that suits what I'm looking for, but also what each of them is looking for. So they're always telling me, oh, why don't we do this book club? Or why don't we do this workshop? Or, we have a workshop coming up on stress and worry, because people are asking for that. And so I'm really trying to just cater to what the needs of the community are. And so essentially, if people are interested, they can just reach out to me directly and I can have a conversation with them. It's not necessarily sustainable from a business perspective, but that's what I really want to have, a high touch, very intimate community. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Oh, that sounds fabulous. And I'll have all the links in the show notes for all of your programs. That's great. So you talk about something else that I think is very important: separating emotion from analysis. So often we think by analyzing the situation, that is going to bring us, that's what we need to do. And we could spend 20 hours analyzing the problem. And the truth is that doesn't. I know it's probably, it just keeps us in the cycle, and it doesn't solve the problem at all. So why don't you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think part of this is, again, comes back to self-awareness, is really understanding there's an emotion, and then there's also a reason for that emotion. And it could be a small reason, it could be a pattern from history, it could be trauma, it could be so many different things. But our emotions are connected emotionally, and then there's the reason for it, or the analysis around it. So we could spend a lot of time analyzing, or we could spend a lot of time just in our emotion and not realizing what that actually means and why that is actually important. And so I think that's why I talk a lot about separating emotion from your day-to-day, your life, so that you can actually really change it. Otherwise, people talk about subconscious beliefs. Like we have these subconscious beliefs where, we get caught up in our emotions and then we don't actually separate. You almost need an observer or some other person to say, hey, is it really true that you're not good enough? Like we get caught up in some sort of emotion where you feel something and then someone else would be like, that's not necessarily true. And so I think the separation of the emotion and the actual judgment or analysis of that emotion is really, really important. And this is where I think groups are really important. Therapy can be really, really important. Even just recognizing those patterns that, you're always impacted by one particular emotion. It keeps coming up over and over and over again. That kind of helps you to realize what your actual patterns are inside your mind that you might be telling yourself that aren't necessarily true.
So on that note, actually, let's discuss limiting beliefs versus limitless beliefs, because
Yes.
I like the way you phrase that as well. I think that's such a helpful way to look at it.
Yeah, for sure. So I know we talk, I think I hear this a lot in social media, like limiting beliefs. And I do believe that it's true, but I don't think we always realize what they are or that we have them, right? So a limiting belief, for example, would be like, I'm not good enough. Some people might think like, I don't want to make this presentation. I don't want to, talk to this person because I feel like I'm not good enough. And this is where social media comes into, which is why I've like been off of social media, because I feel like for your mental stress, it's really difficult. It's good for so many other reasons, but you end up comparing and things like that. And so I think this is one of the reasons why I really like the high touch piece, or intimate piece, because the social media seems very fake and it kind of reinforces those limiting beliefs. Like, I'm not good enough. That person has a better life than I do, all of these types of beliefs. And so what I like to do is try to retrain the brain into thinking about limitless beliefs. And so there's ways that you can, either through journaling, affirmations, understanding your emotions, like really getting to the root problem of all of these things. All the things that I've learned in healthcare are now applicable in daily life. It doesn't have to be necessarily with health, right? And so sometimes it's about reframing who you are. So I'll give you an example, and this might be relevant for your audience who is dealing maybe with osteoporosis, where activity is really, really important and staying active is really important. And so when I was a kid, I had asthma. And so I never was active. I never considered myself an active person, but I really liked sports. I really liked hanging out with, the guys, the boy, like my brothers, and, like hanging out and playing and doing things. And so now, as an adult, I'm exercising and doing all of these things because I know it's good for my health. But it's interesting because as I shift and start changing the labels that I call myself, oh, well, I'm active now. I am sporty now. And just changing that label has given me like a limitless belief that I can do it. I don't have to stop. And not to say that, of course, if you have asthma, you should get it checked out by a doctor. But in my personal life, I was able to push myself further than I thought I ever could. And I feel like now I'm more active than I ever have been in my whole life. And in my, mid to late 40s, I feel like that's a pretty good accomplishment, right? And it's all because in my mind, I started calling myself active. I started calling myself athletic, where I never thought of myself that way before. So it turned into a limitless belief rather than a limiting belief.
It's so interesting because so many of the people I see, not so many, but there's a lot of people who are truly couch potatoes, and they got the diagnosis of osteoporosis, and they were forced, but they knew that they had to exercise. So to go from a couch potato to someone who's really exercising on a regular basis is quite something, and it's possible at any age. So I think
it is
so important to not hold those beliefs that really do limit your progress. And I know as a physical therapist, when people started adapting a lot of the practices you talked about, and a lot of that, I saw chronic pain, amazing improvements in chronic pain. And so what about your background? I know there were years that you worked with osteoporosis and bone health in a clinic. What did you see that, were there certain patterns that you saw? What did you see that was most helpful?
Most helpful, I think a lot of it was really understanding bone mechanics. And this is maybe because I like to understand things and I have that sort of, how does your body work and how can you make it work for you? And so I think the biggest thing that I noticed was people didn't really understand bone health at all. They didn't understand that, they needed to exercise or that your body is always turning over bone. Like they didn't really understand that it was a ongoing process. They just thought, oh, well, my bones are what they are and I can't do anything about it. I actually had one lady who quit her job in 9 to 5. She was sitting at her desk all day long. She quit her job. She became a fitness trainer at one of the gyms. And that's what she did. She's like, you know what? I'm in this place in life. I don't need to make this corporate job. My health is more important to me. And so she literally, after her diagnosis, quit her job, became a fitness trainer. And she changed her bone density very significantly because of all this exercise she was doing. And she thought, I love fitness. I love Zumba. I love teaching yoga. And she just became a fitness trainer and her bone density was, it changed so dramatically that I just thought, look at that. She really took that in her own hands. And of course, everyone's situation is going to be different. But I think it's that knowledge that I can do something about it and I'm going to do something about it. And I'm going to prioritize that. That was really, I thought, empowering.
Yeah, it's so interesting because people don't realize, they know they have to exercise, but they don't realize how critical this piece is and how it's so life-changing in so many ways. And I see people now I have people in classes in their late 80s, 90s helping me move furniture because they're active. And there's such a difference when people start really getting in an appropriate exercise program for balance, for strength, for your mind. It's really amazing. That's a great story. So.
Yeah. The other thing I want to mention here, just related to what you said, is it's okay to find something that's appropriate for you. Like you don't have to quit your job and become a fitness trainer. My mom had osteoporosis and now she had knee surgery. Like she's had all these issues. But now she's found that she really loves aquasize and she's like, it's working for her. She's loving it. So sometimes it's just about finding things that work for you and your lifestyle and your personality and your motivation. And she's found something that works for her, that she enjoys, that she can go to on a regular basis. So I think some of it is really just trying things out and finding what works for you.
That's such a wonderful point because so often I'll see people, oh, I go on the treadmill for 30 minutes, but I can't stand it. So here they're thinking they're exercising to help themselves, but yet what's going on in their head? All this negativity. And so it's just stress, cortisol, which has negative effects on the bone. So that's not what we want at all. Just like you said, and it's not as though you can go on the internet. Okay, I have to do meditation. I have to do this. I have to go on the treadmill. It's not that. That's what's so beautiful. There's so many options that to choose what works with you, what feels good on your body. Is that what you're?
Exactly. And there's so many options for exercise. There's so many options for meditation and journaling. There's so many different types. I think we get caught up in, I need to do everything, all these 10 things that people say I have to do it all. But really, and I think this is where my science background comes in, where I'm like, what is the purpose of this? What are you trying to get out of it? And then find something that works for that purpose, that you enjoy, that keeps you motivated. If it's journaling, you don't have to spend an hour journaling. If it's meditation, you don't have to spend. You can do what works for you. Maybe it's journaling multiple times in a day. Maybe that's better for you, 5 minutes each time. Like each person has something different that's going to work for them. As long as you're getting the benefit, you don't have to do 100 things and put it again on your to-do list, right?
Exactly. Well, what have you seen with overwhelm? To me, overwhelm is the enemy. What have you seen in your practice with people trying, really having good intentions, but going the next step, which is creating overwhelm?
I definitely saw a lot of overwhelm, and especially being in fertility, like you can imagine when women are trying to have a baby, it's a very stressful time and they would take on so much, and I would always say you have to get your partners involved and all these things because of course, it takes both partners. But there was so much overwhelm and so much responsibility and guilt and feeling like if I don't do this, I'm just not going to get it. And so I think what was the best thing for me is to help people understand, like, as I said, why does this work and why do you need this? So this was sort of the biggest hurdle, I think. And as soon as you can pass that hurdle, I'll give you one really simple example. Everyone was like, I need to meditate and meditate. We all know how much research there is on meditation. Meditation is so fantastic for so many reasons, but it's unattainable for a lot of people. They feel like I don't have the time, or I don't have the patience, or I'm thinking about 100 other things on my list, and we just never sit down. And so one of the workshops that I did was to say, like, what can we do for meditators who aren't meditators, like people who want to meditate but aren't meditating? And part of that is understanding the benefits of that it gets in the brain, where you're actually slowing down your brain processes. There's certain pieces of the brain where the brain needs to actually feel positive, thoughts, as you said, not negative thoughts. You have to feel in the flow. You have to feel happy. And so you can get similar benefits to meditation. It doesn't have to be an hour. It could be starting slow. It could be kindness meditation, where you're thinking about something. So you're not having to turn your brain off. This is the part that most people have a hard time with, is how do I turn my brain off? It could be gratitude. It could be running. It could be surfing. It could be knitting. There's so many things that can put you in a state of calm and meditative, like a meditative state, that can have the similar effects on the brain. And so we just have to find something that works. And then that sort of unlocks all the other benefits, right? It doesn't have to be in a certain way. And so that's, I think, the thing that we need to get over, is that we have to do everything in a certain way.
That's so great. When I started meditating, I went to a class, and it was an 8 week. It was it was the mindfulness-based stress reduction program I had took. And I got a speeding ticket on the way to meditation. And that hit me in the head, that this is absolutely not what this is about. And it made me take this class so seriously and start step by step, slowly incorporating it into
You probably needed that class.
oh, that, I realized that I wasn't practicing here. As a physical therapist, I'm teaching breathing, and I'm teaching all these people how important it is to reduce their stress. And I was happy, but because you can be happy but still be running, stress doesn't have to be negative. But yet I was certainly not relaxed, and just sort of taking each day. I was not doing that at all. So it hit me in the head, which was good. I welcome these things because it was life changing, and ever since then, that was around 11 years ago, and that it's become a major part of my life. But just like you said, to do things slowly, avoiding overwhelm is so important.
Yeah, and having that realization that, oh, this is not the purpose of going to this meditation class, speeding to get there. Like, that's, it's an important realization. So I think that's great that you had that experience. It's always an iterative process, right? We're always learning and
It's
making things
true.
better.
It's true. And I always welcome that. I'm always grateful, because then, a lot of times when you're going through things, you don't know, you can't connect the dots until afterwards. And you realize how monumental and how critical that was for me to be where I am now. And so, in terms of what you've seen physically,
Mhm.
what have you seen physically when people have added this piece after they're doing other things? Have you actually seen, I know you have, so why don't you share some of the things, maybe some examples of what you've seen improve when people have added this piece of caring for themselves and doing all of these things that you've talked about?
Oh, it's night and day difference. It's just such a big change. I mean, you can imagine, of course, the mental shift too, but physically, I mean, your heart rate benefits, your blood pressure benefits, even like just your musculoskeletal, like if you're exercising and you're under stress, exercise can actually feel worse afterwards. You feel exhausted. Whereas if you feel happy and you feel positive about the exercise and it's done at an appropriate level for you, you can feel energized, right? So there's so many physical benefits because of course, I'm sure you've talked a lot about cortisol and all of the stress hormones. And then even from a female hormone perspective, we can talk about males too. I think most of your audience is female though. So like the estrogen, the progesterone, the cycles, all of these things change when your body is in a state of relaxation and a state of peace and calm. And it doesn't have to be that you're always in that state of relaxation, but when you incorporate some of these changes, your body, your periods go better. Even just the switch to menopause. Like I used to tell people that when you're in menopause, it's a very different state because your hormones are changing, or your hormones have already changed, rather, they're in a different state. And so incorporating some of these emotional things will really help your body to realize a balanced level versus having a feeling where you always feel like you're in control and nothing's working. So I've noticed a lot of physical changes for sure.
I love what you're saying, because people don't realize that they can actually, by doing these practices, change their hormones. I don't think people realize the really serious impact that they can have, and that this is absolutely as important as every single thing they're doing. If not, to me, it's actually the base. It's actually start with this and then everything else will become easier. But you really have a background because you've dealt with fertility. So did you see this piece being critical and just, in terms of people getting pregnant and in terms, because things have to work for that, that's a
Yes.
time in life and this is so important.
Yes, 100%. I used to see that all the time. And I think the thing that people don't realize is, we think about our bodies as, okay, we should check our blood pressure and our heart rate and our breathing rate, but your hormones are just as important. So I would say that they go right up there as like, is your body working? Like your hormone cycle is a really key indicator as to where your body is in terms of its health state. And so for women who are in their reproductive years, that was a critical sign that people don't tend to ask about. Nobody knows. We don't realize. We just take it for granted. And to be fair, a lot of times you don't get that education, even in healthcare and school. So you don't know that this is such a critical sign, but it was definitely a critical sign. I had some women who were having really difficult jobs and they would take some time off and their hormones would balance out just because they had less stress. And that's not, of course, the solution for everyone, but it was such a marked difference that you can really tell that this was something that was impacting her in such an important way that she needed that time and that space to be able to rebalance her hormones.
And what about postmenopausal women? What would you suggest? They don't have the cycle to look at. Any
Yes.
suggestions for them?
Yeah, a lot of it is your energy. So that's a really big factor too. So a lot of women after postmenopausal, they have either low energy or they're stressed or things like that. So the energy is a really, really important factor. Your libido is another really important factor because of course that's linked to hormones, but also energy. And also thyroid is something that a lot of women don't realize is impacting them. So the thyroid plays a big role in a lot of different hormonal processes, but a lot of metabolic processes as well. So that's something to look at too. And with the thyroid, it could be energy, it could be metabolism, it could be hunger, it could be temperature regulation. So there's all these other things that can be impacting you that you're not realizing is linked to hormones.
Oh, that's great. Wow. There's so many things that you've shared that are so important. Is there anything we left out or other things that you would like to share with this audience?
No, just that I feel like we all have to pay attention to ourselves a little bit more, maybe ask questions of people who can give us other approaches. And I think the biggest thing is the non-judgment. That's something that we didn't really talk about, but I feel like sometimes it's easy to say like, oh, I didn't do this right, or I wish I did this before and not now, or, I should have done this, like the shoulds, the guilt and the judgment. I feel like part of the self-awareness and also just getting what you want in life and being happy is recognizing where you're at now and the tools that you had or have and not judging anything about it, just really going with it and recognizing that each day is a new day. So really approaching yourself and your thoughts and your body without that judgment, but trying to feel like I can do something to make it better.
And is there, before we end, this is just too important to I need to stop you for a minute because that's so important, this judgment piece. But is there any little tricks that we can tell ourselves? Because so many people do that. You really hit something that's so important about, about judging, like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or why did I do that? And then we spend countless hours. I mean, 80% of our thoughts are negative, and we just go on and on beating ourselves up about something that we did. That's the past. And living in the past, we know isn't helpful, but what could we tell ourselves? Are there any little tricks that you've discovered when that happens?
Yes, that's a really good question because there are actually in psychology these things called cognitive distortions where we think something, but it isn't actually true. So we think that we're, as I gave the example, I'm not good enough, or it's all or none, like, oh, I did this mistake and therefore everything is bad in my life. Like we have all these, I guess, distortions of the way we think, and we all have them. It's not, not one person or another. We all have them. But one of the tools and tricks that I tell people is really just to focus on the positives, because I feel like our bodies are wired, for survival, right? Like, and I think you've mentioned this too, to your audience, I'm sure, but we're wired for survival. And so we're trying to survive. So we're wired to think about the negatives and the things that might cause us harm or the things that might make us die. And one of those examples is, if we think someone's not going to like us, that's a social belonging piece. Like if we're alone in the jungle, we're not going to make it. But if we're with a bunch of people, then we're more likely to survive. So if you think about it as a survival, if someone doesn't like you, it's more of a safety threat. And so what I tell people is we're wired to think about negative thoughts. So what we need to do is really spend more time thinking about the positive thoughts. So one example could be I had one patient who was always upset about her career. She felt like she wasn't doing a good job at her career. And so one of the things she did was she created a journal where anytime she did something good, or anytime someone said she did a good job or she completed a project, she just wrote it down. And so anytime she had those, I guess, insecure thoughts, she would go back to her journal and look at all of her accomplishments. And it sort of helped her to really savor the good pieces rather than the negative pieces. So that's one tool that has worked really well.
You're talking my language. I love it. Celebrate your wins. They're never too small. Just keep celebrating. Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. You've shared so much great information. And really, I think the key is, as you've said, is that we need to prioritize ourselves and we need to look at these pieces and just listen to our bodies and understand. And I just love the work you're doing, coming from the background you came from and adding, seeing how important this piece is and now sharing that with the world, which is just so beautiful. So thank you for sharing that with us. And
thank you so much for having me. It's always wonderful to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Rishma and now have some new tools and action steps you can put into your life to help prioritize yourself as well as reduce limiting beliefs. And the good news is that when you do this, you can improve your overall health and well-being. So thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.